In 1997, a boy vanished from his family's farmhouse without a trace. No broken windows, no footprints. Just one strange thing left behind. The furnace in the basement began to breathe. It was as if the house itself had inhaled, holding on to the memory of the child that had disappeared. The sounds started faintly at first, soft whispers, a low hum from the depths of the basement. But over time, they grew louder, more rhythmic, like the breath of something alive. No one knew what happened to Jacob Kesler. The police were baffled. The neighbors speculated. But no one could explain the strange happenings that followed his disappearance. The house seemed to remember him in a way that no one else did. And it wouldn't let go. Nearly 28 years later, Emily Kesler received a letter. She hadn't heard her mother's voice in almost 6 years, but this letter, yellowed and unsealed, brought everything rushing back. Inside, it read only 4 words. "He's still there behind the furnace." Her heart pounded as she stared at the faded handwriting. The name, Emily Kesler, scrawled on the envelope. The letter arrived on a Thursday morning, tucked between a bank statement and an old real estate flyer. The words seemed to burn through her, as if they had been waiting to be read all this time. The memories of her brother Jacob came flooding back. The farmhouse, the basement door that no one had ever been able to open. The whispers behind that door that Emily remembered so well. She used to tell herself it was just her imagination. But now, after nearly 3 decades, she wasn't so sure anymore. Her hands trembled as she read the words again. He's still there, behind the furnace. There was no return address, no explanation. Only this chilling message. Something was waiting for her. Something that remembered. And Emily was about to face it. Emily sat at her kitchen table, staring at the letter in her hands, trying to make sense of it. The faded envelope still held the faint scent of old paper and dust. It was strange how something so small could trigger a flood of memories, memories she had long buried. Her fingers brushed over the edges of the envelope, feeling the weight of what it had carried. Something more than ink on paper. She had grown up in this house, the farmhouse where her brother had disappeared. The same house that had been silent ever since. But today, the silence was different. Today, it was as if the house itself was whispering again, calling her back. Emily hadn't set foot in the farmhouse in over a decade. She had left as soon as she could, escaping the haunting memories of a childhood that ended too abruptly. The farmhouse, nestled at the edge of a winding country road, looked as it always had, weathered and tired. The windows were dark, and the porch creaked under the weight of years. The front door, once painted a bright red, now hung crooked on its hinges. It was a house that had seen better days. Yet it was home, in a way. Home to memories that Emily could no longer escape, no matter how far she ran. The letter in her hands held the answer to why she had to return. It had been sent by her mother, who had kept the house running all these years. But why? Why now? After so many years of silence, with a deep breath, Emily stood up and moved to the small hallway closet. There, buried beneath years of forgotten things, was the box labeled 1997 photos. The year her brother had vanished. It seemed like a lifetime ago, yet the memories were still vivid in her mind. She opened the box and sifted through the old photographs, tattered police flyers, newspaper clippings with her brother's face on them. Jacob Kesler, age 8, missing since June 2nd, 1997. The police had combed the farmhouse, checking every room, every corner. But the basement was always off limits. No one could get to the utility room, the old furnace room that had been sealed shut for years. Emily had always wondered what was behind that door, the door that no one had ever managed to open. As a child, she would lie in her bed at night, listening to the strange sounds that came from the basement. Not the clank of old pipes, but something softer, almost like scratching. She had told no one. Certainly not her parents. Who would believe her? It was just a child's imagination, wasn't it? But now, with the letter in her hand, she wasn't so sure. The words on the page seemed to pierce her heart. He's still there, behind the furnace. Could it be? Could Jacob have been left behind in that dark, forgotten part of the house? Was there something that had kept him there all these years? Something that wasn't ready to let go? Emily's hand shook as she picked up the phone, her finger hovering over the number to her mother. She hadn't spoken to her in months. The distance between them had grown over the years, but now, it seemed like there was no other choice. Her mother had sent this letter for a reason. She had to know why. The phone rang once, twice. Then, finally, it clicked, and her mother's voice came through, thinner than she remembered. "Emily?" "Mom," Emily said quietly. "I got the letter." There was a long pause. Emily's heart pounded in her chest as she waited for her mother's response. "Did you call anyone?" her mother asked, her voice faltering. "No," Emily replied. "But I think it's time." She hung up the phone, the weight of her decision settling in. She was going back. She was going home. The drive north was long, the miles stretching out before her like a dark, endless road. Every mile felt like it was pulling her backward in time, back to the place she had tried so hard to forget. The farmhouse loomed ahead, as familiar as ever, its outline framed by the setting sun. It hadn't changed much, but Emily had. She was no longer the 11-year-old girl who had played here with her brother, laughing and running through the fields. She was a woman now, scarred by years of grief and unanswered questions. She parked in the gravel driveway, the tires crunching on the frost-covered ground. The mailbox, hanging crookedly by one rusted screw, still carried her family's name, a remnant of the past. Emily took a deep breath and stepped out of the car, the cold air biting at her skin. She walked toward the front door, her footsteps echoing in the stillness. Before she could even knock, the door creaked open. Her mother stood there, smaller than Emily remembered, wrapped in a pale cardigan. The years had taken their toll. Her mother's hair was streaked with silver, and deep lines had formed around her mouth. The silence stretched between them, heavy and thick. Finally, her mother stepped back, allowing Emily to enter. The house felt as cold as it looked, the air heavy with memories. "I kept the heat running just in case," her mother said softly, her voice almost a whisper. Emily nodded and stepped inside, crossing the threshold into the past. The farmhouse felt different now. The shadows were longer, the air thicker. It was hard to shake the feeling that something was watching, waiting. Emily crossed the old entryway, past the braided rug she remembered from her childhood, and stood in front of the grandfather clock. It had stopped ticking years ago, but the absence of sound seemed to echo louder now, almost like the silence of the house had taken on a life of its own. Her eyes lingered on the faded photograph of Jacob, still hanging in the hallway. His school photo, the one he had taken right before he vanished. The image captured his wide, toothless grin, his oversized flannel shirt, and the mischievous gleam in his eyes. Emily's throat tightened. The photo hadn't changed, but everything else had. The house, the family, the memories, they were all different now, coated in a layer of dust, both literal and metaphorical. She had to swallow back the lump in her throat. Her brother had been 8 years old when he disappeared. It was June 2nd, 1997, and it was a day like any other. Emily had been playing outside, chasing after a butterfly, when Jacob ran inside, his face pale, his eyes wide with terror. He had always been sensitive, prone to nightmares and fears that no one else seemed to understand. But this time, it was different. He had been frantic. "They're watching me," he had whispered, pulling her close. "They're watching us from the basement." Emily had laughed it off at the time, thinking he was just being a child, playing pretend. But when he ran toward the basement door, his small hand clutching the knob with a trembling grip. Something about the way he looked back at her made her uneasy. He had said something then, something she would never forget. "There's something down there. I can hear it breathing." Emily had pulled him away from the door, telling him it was just the furnace, just the pipes. But deep down, she had felt a strange chill run through her. She had never been scared of the basement before, not even when she was little, but Jacob's fear felt real. Too real. She had tried to shake the thought from her mind, but Jacob wouldn't stop talking about it. Over the next few days, he refused to go near the basement. He cried if anyone opened the door too wide. He kept saying that the furnace was alive, that it was waiting for them. Everyone thought it was just a phase, something children grow out of. But now, standing in the old farmhouse again, Emily couldn't help but wonder if Jacob had known something that no one else had. On June 2nd, when Jacob went missing, the police had scoured the house, the surrounding fields, and even the nearby woods. They had questioned everyone, the neighbors, the friends. No one had seen him. No one had heard a thing. The house was still. It was as if Jacob had simply disappeared into thin air. The only clue left behind was the sound of the furnace, that eerie, rhythmic breathing that no one could explain. Emily's mind went back to that moment. The police had insisted the farmhouse was secure, that there were no signs of forced entry, no broken windows, no footprints. They believed Jacob had simply wandered off. The idea seemed absurd to Emily. He hadn't been the type of child to run away. He was afraid of the dark, afraid of being alone. There had been only one part of the house that the police couldn't access: the basement utility room, the furnace area that had been sealed off for years. They had said nothing of importance was behind that door. But Emily remembered the whispers, the strange sounds that came from behind the warped door, the soft scratching noise that never seemed to stop. She had convinced herself it was just her imagination. But now, after reading the letter, Emily wasn't so sure anymore. Was it really all just a child's fantasy? Emily closed her eyes, trying to push the memory away. But the past had a way of resurfacing when you least expected it. She could still hear Jacob's voice in her mind, faint but clear. "The furnace is alive, Emily. It breathes. It remembers." Her fingers trembled as she reached for the box of old photographs, buried in the corner of the living room. It was dusty, covered in years of neglect. Inside were police flyers with Jacob's face on them, newspaper clippings, and photographs from family gatherings, all frozen in time. Emily ran her fingers over the old pictures, each one a painful reminder of what they had lost. The last photo of Jacob, taken just a week before he disappeared, showed him standing by the old oak tree in their backyard. He was holding up a toy he had made himself, a small, wooden figure of a boy with a lantern. Emily remembered how proud he had been of that toy, how he had carried it everywhere. He had told her it was his favorite thing in the world. It was the last time she saw him smile. She had never told anyone about the toy. She had never told anyone about how Jacob had said the lantern would keep him safe from whatever was down in the basement. And now, all these years later, Emily couldn't help but wonder, had Jacob known more than he had let on? Was the house still holding on to him, waiting for someone to finally listen? The kitchen smelled faintly of old coffee and something else, dust and cedar, the scent of time itself. Emily sat at the worn table, her fingers curling around the handle of her coffee cup. Her mother had gone upstairs to rest, leaving her alone in the house that had once been her home. It felt strangely familiar, yet foreign. The house hadn't changed much in the years that had passed. The same braided rug sat by the entryway. The same grandfather clock that had long stopped ticking still loomed against the wall. The same smell of old books and firewood lingered in the air, an aroma that carried memories with it. Memories Emily had tried so hard to forget. But the house wouldn't let her. It never did. She had always been drawn to the basement as a child, curious about the mysteries it held. She remembered sneaking down the stairs with Jacob in tow, daring each other to get closer to the furnace. The furnace was the heart of the house, its low, steady hum vibrating through the floorboards. It had always seemed so alive, so powerful, that Emily had convinced herself it was nothing more than the house settling, or the pipes contracting with the cold. But Jacob had believed differently. He had told her once that something lived behind the furnace, that the furnace itself was alive, breathing in the darkness. At the time, Emily had laughed it off, brushing it off as childish imagination. But now, with the letter in her hand and the memories of that summer flooding back, she wasn't so sure. The basement had been sealed off for as long as Emily could remember. Her father had always said it was nothing to worry about, that the furnace room had just become too dangerous to access. Over the years, the door had become warped, its once sturdy latch rusted and rusting with age. It had been locked, sealed shut, just like the memory of Jacob. But Emily had heard it. The whispering, the soft scratching sounds that came from behind the door. It was a sound she had buried deep inside, convincing herself it was just the wind or a creaking floorboard. After all, what could possibly be behind that door? It was just an old furnace room, a part of the house they never used. Still, she had never stopped wondering. When Jacob had vanished, that door had remained shut, and the whispering had stopped. The sound had died, and for the first time in years, Emily had been able to sleep without hearing it. But now, the house had begun to speak again. Emily stood up, her legs stiff from sitting too long, and walked slowly toward the hallway closet. Her hand hesitated on the doorknob, as if it were a sacred space she shouldn't disturb. Inside, in the very back, was the box labeled 1997 photos. The year her brother had disappeared. The year everything had changed. She reached for it, her fingers trembling as she lifted the lid. The box was heavy, filled with newspaper clippings, photographs, and memories of a time before Jacob's disappearance. She had not seen most of these in years. There were photos of the family at birthdays, holidays, and summer afternoons in the backyard. She sifted through the images, feeling each one like a punch to the gut, until she came across a picture she hadn't seen in years. It was a photo of the basement, taken from the top of the stairs. It showed the warped door to the furnace room. Emily had no memory of taking this picture, but there it was. In the corner of the photo, a shape, faint, barely visible, hovered near the door. It wasn't clear, just a shadow, but it looked like a figure. The hair on the back of Emily's neck stood up as she stared at it. Had she taken this picture? Or had someone else? Her heart pounded as she turned the photo over. On the back, her father's handwriting was scrawled in faded ink. "The furnace is alive. The house remembers." Her father had always been a practical man, never one to entertain the idea of ghosts or spirits. But these words struck a chord deep within Emily. The house remembered? What did that mean? For years, her father had dismissed the basement as a mere inconvenience. He had sealed it off, locked it up, and never spoke of it again. But had he known something she didn't? Had he felt the same unease about the house that Emily did? What had he meant by, "the furnace is alive"? The thought nagged at her, but she couldn't yet make sense of it. The whispers, the breathing, her father's cryptic words. They were all connected, and whatever was behind that door, whatever her father had been hiding, was still here. Emily stood in front of the old photograph, her mind racing. What if her father had known all along? What if the house wasn't just haunted by memories? It was haunted by something more, something that had been waiting for them all this time. The basement door loomed in her mind, its rusted latch just as unyielding now as it had been all those years ago. Was she ready to open it? Was she prepared to face whatever had been sealed inside? The question haunted her as she placed the photo back into the box and closed it, her thoughts swirling with the weight of her discovery. There was no going back now. Emily knew she had to find the answers, no matter how terrifying they might be. The letter still lay on the table in front of Emily, its message reverberating in her mind like a persistent echo. He's still there, behind the furnace. She had read those words a dozen times, and each time, they seemed to carve deeper into her thoughts, like something she couldn't shake off. What did it mean? Was it a warning? A plea for help? Or was it something more sinister? Something that had been waiting for all these years? The silence in the farmhouse was oppressive, suffocating even. The air seemed to hang heavy, as though the house itself was holding its breath. Emily sat motionless, her mind racing, her thoughts tangled in a web of memories and questions that she wasn't sure she was ready to face. She had lived her life for the past 2 decades without any answers, and now, this letter had opened a door. One she wasn't sure she was prepared to walk through. Her mother's words, too, echoed in her mind. "Did you call anyone?" Emily had hesitated before replying. "No," she had said, but she knew that the decision to go back to the farmhouse wasn't just about facing the past. It was about confronting something she had buried deep inside her all these years. Emily had never truly let go of Jacob. His disappearance had haunted her, had shaped her in ways she couldn't even understand. But now, with this letter in her hand, she realized that the past had never really let go of her, either. The furnace, the breathing, it all seemed so ridiculous, so surreal. How could a furnace breathe? How could it have anything to do with Jacob's disappearance? But Emily knew better than to dismiss the strange sounds, the whispers that had once filled the house. She had heard them as a child, late at night, when the house was still and everything felt wrong. They had always seemed to come from the direction of the basement, from the very place that had been sealed off from the rest of the house. That door, the furnace room. Emily had never been allowed to go near it, had never been allowed to ask about it. And now, that very place was calling her back. She stood up suddenly, the chair scraping across the floor as she pushed it back. The decision was made. Emily had to know. She had to go down to that furnace room. She couldn't keep running from the past. She couldn't keep pretending that Jacob had just disappeared without a trace. There was something in that basement, something connected to her brother's vanishing, and she was going to find out what it was. Emily crossed the hallway, her footsteps slow and deliberate, her heart pounding in her chest. The house seemed to hold its breath as she neared the stairs that led down into the basement. The door at the bottom of the stairs was the same as it had always been, old, weathered, and sealed shut with rusted locks. Her hand hovered over the handle for a moment, but she couldn't bring herself to touch it. It felt like a boundary she wasn't ready to cross. But the letter, the words, haunted her. He's still there. What if she was wrong? What if Jacob had never left? What if the house had kept him? The thought sent a chill down her spine. With a steadying breath, Emily gripped the door handle and twisted it. The door creaked loudly, the sound echoing through the silence of the house. For a moment, she stood frozen, the weight of the moment pressing down on her. But then slowly, the door began to give, the rusted metal groaning in protest as she pulled it open. A faint scent of dust and musty air seeped into her lungs, and she stepped inside. The basement was colder than the rest of the house, the air thick with the smell of damp stone. The walls were lined with old shelves, filled with forgotten boxes of junk. Emily's flashlight flickered as she moved deeper into the room, the beam catching on various objects. Old furniture, stacks of unused blankets, and piles of miscellaneous debris. But none of that mattered. She was here for one thing and one thing only: the furnace. She turned to face the far corner of the room, her eyes scanning the shadows. And there it was, the furnace, standing tall and imposing in the corner. The furnace had always been the heart of the house, the source of warmth during the harsh winter months. But now, it felt like something more. It loomed in the darkness, almost alive in the way it seemed to consume the light around it. Emily stepped forward, the floor creaking underfoot as she neared it. She could feel the heat radiating from the furnace, the warmth creeping into her skin like a living presence. Her breath caught in her throat as she reached out a hand to touch the cold metal of the furnace. The air around her seemed to grow heavier, and for a moment she could have sworn she felt something else, a shift, a pull, something that wasn't quite right. The furnace hummed, a low, steady sound that seemed to vibrate through her chest. She could hear it, the breathing, soft, rhythmic, like the slow inhale and exhale of something waiting. The sound filled the room, surrounding her. And for a moment, Emily was certain it wasn't just the furnace making that noise. It was something else, something that had been waiting all these years. Emily stood in the cold basement, her breath visible in the dim light. The furnace's rhythmic hum filled the room, almost as if it were alive, waiting. She stepped closer to it, the heat radiating off its metallic surface. But it wasn't the warmth that sent a shiver down her spine. It was the feeling that something had been hidden here for years, something that had been locked away and forgotten. Her flashlight flickered, casting eerie shadows on the stone walls. The house had always felt alive, but tonight it felt different, heavier, as though the past had been awakened. She couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching her, something that had been waiting for her to return. The furnace, with its constant breathing, seemed to embody the house itself, always present, always watching. Emily's eyes moved around the basement, searching for anything that could explain the strange sensation. There were old shelves stacked with forgotten boxes, broken furniture that hadn't been touched in years. But her gaze kept returning to the furnace. The whispers, the breathing, she couldn't ignore them any longer. She had to know the truth. She had to find out what had really happened to Jacob. With determination, Emily crouched down and examined the furnace more closely. The air felt dense, like the walls themselves were pressing in on her. She could hear the faintest scratching sound from behind the furnace, just like Jacob had described when he was a child. The sound was subtle, but unmistakable. Emily felt a wave of unease wash over her as she reached out to touch the furnace. Her fingers brushed against the cold metal, and the sound grew louder, almost as if the furnace were responding to her touch. Her heart raced, and she pulled her hand back. She wasn't sure what she had expected, but it certainly wasn't this. This feeling of being connected to something ancient and otherworldly, something that had been buried beneath the house for so long. She couldn't ignore the sense that there was something more. The letter, the whispers, the furnace, all these elements were pointing to one thing: the basement, the sealed room, and the memories that had been buried here for nearly 30 years. Emily stood up, looking around the room. The space felt claustrophobic, as though the walls were closing in on her. She couldn't help but feel that the answers were just out of reach, waiting for her to find them. But where? The basement was so full of clutter. Old tools, broken appliances, stacks of newspapers. Nothing seemed to stand out. Nothing seemed to offer a clue to the mystery she was trying to unravel. But then, something caught her eye. In the far corner of the room, near the back wall, she saw an old, rusted metal latch. It was hidden beneath a layer of dust and debris, but she recognized it immediately. It was the latch to the furnace room, the one that had been sealed shut all those years ago, the one her father had warned her to never go near. Emily's heart skipped a beat as she moved toward it. She had never seen this latch before. It had always been hidden, buried under piles of forgotten items. But now, it was clear. The latch had been deliberately covered, concealed. Someone didn't want her to find it. Her pulse quickened as she crouched down to examine it more closely. The latch was old, the metal corroded and weak. It looked like it hadn't been touched in decades. But now, Emily knew it had to be opened. She reached for it, her fingers trembling as she gripped the rusty metal. With a quick motion, she yanked it open. The latch gave way with a squeal of protest, and Emily's heart raced as she slowly pulled the door open. The room behind the furnace was dark, even darker than the basement, and a wave of stale air hit her face as the door creaked open. For a moment, Emily hesitated. The shadows in the room seemed to pulse, alive with secrets that had been kept hidden for far too long. But she knew she couldn't turn back. Whatever was in that room, whatever had been locked away all these years, was waiting for her. It had been waiting for someone to listen, someone to uncover the truth. With a deep breath, Emily stepped into the darkness. The room behind the furnace was colder than the rest of the basement, as if it had been sealed off from the rest of the house for a reason. The moment Emily stepped inside, a shiver ran down her spine. It wasn't just the temperature that made her uneasy. It was the stillness. The silence was deafening, a thick, suffocating blanket that seemed to press in from all sides. She pulled her flashlight from her pocket, its beam cutting through the darkness and revealing the walls lined with old shelves, crates, and forgotten boxes. The dust in the air seemed to dance as the light flickered. But there was something else, something far more unsettling. A strange, musty smell hung in the air, the kind of smell that made Emily want to recoil. It was as if something had been trapped here for years, something that had been waiting to be found. At first glance, nothing in the room stood out. There were no obvious signs of what had been hidden here all these years. No mysterious markings or strange symbols on the walls. But as Emily moved deeper into the room, something caught her eye. A small wooden crate, tucked away behind a pile of old blankets and boxes. It was different from the others, newer, more carefully placed. Curiosity tugged at her, and she moved toward it, her heart pounding in her chest. The crate was unmarked, simple, almost ordinary. But the way it was positioned, almost as if it had been deliberately hidden, made her pause. She knelt down beside it and brushed the dust off the top. With a hesitant hand, she pried it open, the old wood creaking under her touch. Inside, there were several items stacked neatly, wrapped in what looked like old cloth. Emily's fingers trembled as she reached in, pulling out the first object, a small, wooden figurine of a boy holding a lantern. Her breath caught in her throat as she recognized it immediately. It was the same figurine Jacob had made as a child, the one he had always carried with him, the same one he had shown her that day before he disappeared. Emily had never seen it again, never thought about it since that day. But here it was, in this crate, as if it had been waiting for her to find it. The figurine felt cold to the touch, the wood worn and smooth from years of handling. Emily ran her fingers over it, her mind racing. Why was this here? How had it ended up behind the furnace, hidden away in this forgotten room? Her heart began to race, her thoughts spinning out of control. Was this a clue? A message from Jacob? Or was it something more? As she set the figurine aside, Emily noticed something else in the crate, something that made her blood run cold. Beneath the figurine, she found a bundle of yellowed papers, tied together with a piece of fraying twine. She carefully unwrapped the bundle, each paper brittle and fragile with age. The first page was a handwritten letter, the ink faded but still legible. Emily's breath caught as she read the words, the recognition setting in immediately. It was her father's handwriting. The letter was addressed to Emily herself, though it was never sent. The date on the letter was June 5, 1997, just days after Jacob had vanished. Emily. The letter began, the words shaky and uneven, as if written in a rush. I'm sorry. I never wanted you to know. But the house, it knows. It remembers everything. It's been alive for years, feeding off the memories we've left behind. And Jacob. Jacob wasn't just taken. He was kept. It wanted him, needed him. It had been calling to him for years, whispering to him in the basement. He heard it, and it kept him. We tried to stop it, tried to lock it away, but it's too strong. If you read this, It means you're ready. You must find him. Before it's too late. Emily's hands shook as she held the letter, the words sinking in. The house. It had kept Jacob. It had called to him. Just like the whispers he had heard. The furnace. The breathing. It wasn't just a sound. It was something alive, something that had been waiting for Emily to uncover the truth. Her mind reeled with the implications of what she had just read. She had always wondered why Jacob had disappeared so suddenly, so completely. But this was something else entirely. The house had kept him. The house had taken him, and it had kept him locked away, hidden behind the furnace. Suddenly, the room seemed smaller. The walls seemed to close in on her, the air thick with a palpable sense of dread. The breathing from the furnace grew louder, more insistent, as though it were urging her to do something, to act before it was too late. But what was she supposed to do? How could she stop something that had been alive for so long? Something that had fed off the memories of her family. Emily's thoughts were interrupted by a soft sound behind her, a faint creaking of the floorboards. She turned quickly, her heart leaping in her chest. There was no one there, but the feeling of being watched lingered in the air, thick and oppressive. She wasn't alone in this room. Something else was here, something that had been watching her, waiting for her to uncover the truth. The house had kept Jacob, and now it was waiting for her. Emily's pulse quickened as the letter from her father continued to weigh heavily in her hands. She had always known that her family's past held secrets, but she had never imagined the depth of what was being hidden. The house, the furnace, the whispers. It all pointed to something far more sinister than she could have ever anticipated. But there was one more thing, one more piece to the puzzle that had yet to reveal itself. The name that had slipped through the cracks of time. A name Emily hadn't thought of in years. Michael Holbrook. Michael had been the maintenance man for the farmhouse, a quiet, solitary figure who had worked for the Kesler family for nearly a decade. He had been a man of few words, mostly seen carrying tools and checking the pipes in the basement, tending to the furnace during the long, cold winters. But Emily had never trusted him. There had always been something off about him, a strange, unsettling aura that seemed to hang around him like a shadow. And then, one day, Michael disappeared without a trace. It had been right after Jacob had gone missing. No one had seen or heard from Michael since that day. His van had been parked outside the house, but when the police had gone to check, they found nothing. No signs of struggle, no clues to explain where he had gone. He had just vanished, as though he had never existed. Emily had never believed that Michael's disappearance was a coincidence. She had always suspected that he knew something, that he had seen something that he wasn't supposed to, but her parents had brushed off her concerns. They had insisted that Michael was just an odd man who had decided to leave for reasons of his own. But the more Emily thought about it, the more certain she became that Michael Holbrook had played a role in what had happened to Jacob. The letter from her father seemed to confirm that. She needed to know more about Michael. She needed to understand why he had disappeared, and what he might have known about the house and the furnace. The more she thought about it, the more the pieces of the puzzle started to fall into place. Emily left the basement room, the letter still clenched in her hand, and made her way upstairs. The house was eerily quiet, but it was the silence of something ancient, something that had been watching her every move. She needed to dig deeper, to uncover the truth, and she knew exactly where to start. Her father had kept a set of old files in the study, a collection of paperwork that covered the history of the house and the family's dealings. Emily hadn't looked through them in years, but she had a feeling that now, more than ever, they would be the key to understanding what had happened all those years ago. The study smelled like old paper and leather. She approached the desk, where her father had kept a small filing cabinet. Her fingers trembled as she slid open the top drawer and began to sift through the papers. There were tax returns, old bills, and contracts with various repairmen and workers who had come and gone over the years. But then, something caught her eye. An old, yellowed envelope with her father's handwriting scrawled across the front. She opened it carefully, revealing a set of faded photographs. At first glance, they seemed like ordinary family photos. Pictures of the farmhouse, the backyard, Emily and Jacob playing together. But as she flipped through them, one photo stood out. It was a photograph of Michael Holbrook, standing next to the furnace in the basement. His face was obscured by shadows, but there was something about the image that sent a chill down Emily's spine. It wasn't just that Michael looked uncomfortable in the photo. It was the expression on his face, as though he knew something was coming, something he couldn't escape. On the back of the photo, her father had written a note. "Michael Holbrook, he knows what's down there. Don't trust him." Emily's heart stopped. The words were clear, but the meaning was even clearer. Michael Holbrook had known. He had known about the furnace, about the house, about whatever dark force had been lurking beneath the surface for so long. And now, he was gone. Had he left because he had gotten too close to the truth? Had the house driven him away? Or had something more sinister happened to him? Emily's mind raced as she pieced together the information. Her father's warning, the photograph, the strange behavior of Michael. Everything was starting to make sense. The house had been feeding off the memories and energy of the family, using them to grow stronger. And Jacob, with his sensitivity to the supernatural, had been the perfect target. Michael had known this, had seen the changes in the house, and had tried to warn them. But instead, he had disappeared. Emily was left to pick up the pieces, to face the darkness that had been haunting her family for years. She couldn't let Michael's disappearance be in vain. She couldn't let the house win. Emily had to face the truth, no matter how terrifying it might be. The old house stood silent, its every creak and groan now feeling like a warning. Emily's heart raced as she stood at the foot of the basement stairs, staring at the door. The same door that had been sealed for years, the door that held the answer she had been searching for. The furnace hummed in the distance, its rhythmic breathing echoing through the walls. But tonight, it felt different. Tonight, the house wasn't just alive. It was awake, and it was waiting. Her fingers brushed the rusted metal of the door's latch, a cold, metallic chill running through her body as she turned it. The door groaned in protest, reluctant to give way after all these years. Emily's breath caught in her throat as the door slowly creaked open, revealing the dark room beyond. For a moment, everything was still. The house held its breath, as if it were waiting for her to make the first move. Emily stepped forward, her flashlight cutting through the darkness. The beam flickered as she moved deeper into the room, her senses on high alert. The air felt thick, heavy with the weight of secrets that had been buried for far too long. The room was small, its walls lined with shelves filled with dusty boxes and forgotten trinkets. At first glance, it seemed ordinary, a forgotten storage room, left behind when the basement had been sealed off. But as Emily's eyes adjusted to the dim light, she saw it, the furnace. It stood in the far corner, as imposing and ominous as ever. But now, with the door open, the room felt suffocating, as if the furnace itself was somehow breathing, expanding and contracting with the house's unseen pulse. Emily's flashlight flickered again, casting long shadows across the walls. She felt an overwhelming sense of unease, the air growing heavier with each step she took. There was something in this room, something that had been waiting for her, waiting for this moment. She knew she had to face it, whatever it was. She had come this far. There was no turning back now. She moved toward the furnace, her hands trembling as she reached out to touch the cold metal. The moment her fingers brushed against it, the room seemed to shudder. The air grew warmer, and a low, guttural sound filled the room. The sound of something alive, something breathing. Emily jerked her hand back, her breath catching in her throat. "It's alive!" The realization hit her like a physical blow. The furnace wasn't just a machine. It wasn't just a piece of metal that heated the house. It was part of something much older, much darker than she could have ever imagined. It was a part of the house, a part of whatever force had been feeding off her family's memories and fears for decades. She turned, her eyes scanning the room for any sign of what had been hidden here. And then she saw it. Something tucked away in the far corner of the room. A small wooden box, buried beneath a pile of old blankets. It was nondescript, nothing special about it. But Emily knew, instinctively, that it was important. She moved toward it, her heart pounding in her chest as she reached down and lifted the box. The moment her fingers closed around it, a wave of heat washed over her, radiating from the furnace. The box felt warm, almost too warm, as if it had been waiting for her touch. She hesitated for a moment, the weight of the moment sinking in. What if this was the final piece of the puzzle? What if this box held the answer she needed? With trembling hands, Emily opened the box. Inside, she found a bundle of old, yellowed papers. They were fragile, delicate, as though they had been kept hidden for years. The first page was a map. Faded, worn, but unmistakable. It was a map of the farmhouse, of the land surrounding it. But there was something strange about it. The map was marked with symbols, markings that didn't make sense. Arrows pointed to areas of the house, rooms that had been sealed off, areas that had never been mentioned in the house's blueprints. The furnace room was marked with a symbol that looked like a spiral, as if the room itself was a part of something much bigger. Emily's eyes widened as she turned the page. The next sheet was a journal entry, written in her father's handwriting. The house feeds on memories. It always has. It calls to those who are sensitive, who can hear it. Jacob heard it. He was always drawn to it. He could feel it, feel the house shifting, moving, breathing. I tried to stop it. I tried to lock him away from it. But I failed. It wanted him, needed him. It was too strong. And now, it will take him. It will take all of us. Emily's stomach dropped. She had always suspected that something was wrong with the house, that there was something more to Jacob's disappearance. But this was something else entirely. Her father had known. He had known what the house was, what it did, and he had tried to protect them. But it was too late. Jacob had already been claimed. The house had taken him. The journal entry continued. Michael Holbrook knew. He tried to stop it, but he couldn't. The house is too powerful. It uses memories, feeds off them. Jacob's disappearance is just the beginning. I can feel it coming. The house is growing stronger. It won't stop until it has us all. Emily's breath hitched. Michael Holbrook, the maintenance man. He had known. He had tried to stop it. And now, it was clear. Whatever force had been at work in this house, whatever had been pulling Jacob in, was still here. It was still alive, still waiting. And it wasn't done yet. Emily slammed the journal shut, her hands shaking. She felt the weight of her father's words, the heaviness of the truth. The house wasn't just a home. It was a force, a living, breathing entity that fed off the people who lived in it. It had taken Jacob. It had taken Michael. And now, it was waiting for her. The furnace hummed louder, its breath becoming more pronounced. Emily knew what she had to do. She couldn't let the house win. She couldn't let it claim her too. The furnace had to be stopped. The room had to be sealed. Whatever it was that had been feeding off her family's memories had to be stopped. Once and for all. She turned back to the furnace, determination flooding through her veins. This was the moment. She wasn't going to let the house take her too. The air in the basement felt thick, almost suffocating, as Emily turned toward the furnace once more. The heat radiating from it seemed oppressive, almost unnatural. The rhythmic breathing she had once dismissed as nothing more than a trick of the house now felt like a living, breathing presence. Something ancient, something that had been feeding off her family for years. The journal, the letter, the map. Everything she had uncovered over the past few hours had led her to one undeniable truth. The house was alive. It was no longer just a place of memories, of family gatherings and childhood laughter. It was something darker, something far older than she could have imagined. It thrived on memories, on fear, and on the souls of those who had lived and died within its walls. Jacob had been its first victim, but it wasn't done. It wouldn't stop until it had claimed everyone. Her mind raced as she paced the small room, trying to process everything she had learned. The furnace, the breathing, the whispers, it all pointed to one thing. The house wasn't just a home. It was a force, an entity that had taken root in the land itself, feeding off the memories and emotions of the people who had lived here. And it wasn't done with her family. It had waited years for her to return, and now that she was here, it wouldn't let her leave until it had claimed her too. Emily closed her eyes for a moment, trying to steady her breathing. She couldn't panic. Not now. She had to think, had to find a way to stop it before it was too late. She had uncovered the truth, but that didn't mean the battle was over. The house was powerful, and it had a hold on her family, on her life, that was impossible to ignore. She turned toward the door, the one that had been sealed for so long. It seemed almost to beckon her, as if the house were calling her to unlock its secrets. The door that had been closed for decades was now open, but the room beyond it felt darker, more alive, more dangerous than it ever had before. Emily couldn't shake the feeling that whatever was inside the furnace, whatever had been locked away for so long, was the key to everything. It was the heart of the house, and it was feeding off her family's grief, their pain, their fear. Her hands trembled as she approached the furnace again. She had to face it. She had to confront it. Whatever it was, the house had claimed Jacob. It had kept him locked away, hidden from everyone who loved him. It had kept him alive, in some twisted, unnatural way. And it wouldn't stop until it had taken every part of him. Emily wasn't sure how it worked, how the house could feed on memories, on emotions, but she was certain of one thing: it had to be stopped. She reached out, her hand brushing against the cold metal of the furnace. The moment her fingers made contact, a sudden jolt of energy shot through her. The air seemed to thrum, vibrating with the power of the house itself. The breathing from the furnace grew louder, more insistent, as though it were reacting to her touch, responding to her presence. Emily flinched, but she didn't pull her hand away. She had to finish this. She had to understand what had happened to Jacob and what was still holding the house together. The house had taken everything from her: her brother, her family's peace, her sense of safety, and now it was time to take back control. She glanced around the room, her eyes falling on the small wooden box she had found earlier, the one that had held the map, the letter, and the photograph of Michael Holbrook. She hadn't had time to fully examine the contents before, but now, with the furnace humming louder behind her, she knew she had to take a closer look. There was something important in that box, something that could tell her how to stop the house, how to break the cycle. Emily moved toward the box, her fingers trembling as she opened it once again. Inside, she found another sheet of paper, this one older than the others, its edges frayed and torn. It was a letter, written by someone who was long gone, someone who had known the house's secrets. The letter was addressed to her father, written in a shaky, almost frantic hand. If you are reading this, then you are too late. The house has already taken root. It will not let you go. It feeds on fear, on memories, on the souls of those who live in it. I have tried to stop it. I have tried to warn you. But it's too powerful. It wants your son. It wants Jacob. And it will take him, no matter what. There is no way to stop it. The house is too strong. I'm sorry, But it's already too late for all of us. Emily's breath caught in her throat as she read the words. The letter was dated the same day Jacob disappeared. Whoever had written it had known exactly what was happening to her family. They had known that the house was feeding on them, drawing them in with its promises of safety, only to consume them when they were weakest. The finality of the letter, the hopelessness in the words, sent a shiver down her spine. She had to stop it. The house had already taken Jacob, but she couldn't let it take anyone else. She couldn't let it take her. Suddenly, she heard a noise, a soft scraping, a scratching sound coming from the furnace. The noise grew louder, more insistent, like something was moving inside, trying to escape. Emily stepped back, her heart racing. The house wasn't finished with her yet. It was trying to pull her in, trying to drag her into its web of memories and fear. She had one chance. She had to confront the house head-on. She had to break its hold before it consumed her too. With a deep breath, Emily turned to face the furnace once more. The whispers had started again, louder this time, swirling around her like a storm. They were calling her, pulling her toward the furnace, toward the heart of the house. It was time to face the truth. The house had taken her brother. It had fed on her family's pain. But it was no longer in control. Emily would fight back. She wouldn't let the house win. The house was alive. That was the only truth Emily could hold on to in that moment. The furnace, the whispers, the strange happenings that had plagued her family for years. They were all part of something much larger, something ancient. She had read the letter from her father, felt its weight in her hands, and understood the gravity of the situation. But still, as she stood before the furnace, she realized how little she truly knew. The furnace hummed louder, its metallic walls vibrating with an energy that seemed to pulse through the room, through the house. Emily could feel it, deep in her bones, this strange, unsettling presence. The house was a part of the land, a living, breathing entity that had been feeding on the memories of those who had passed through it. Jacob, her brother, had been its first victim, and now it was reaching out for her, for anyone who dared to uncover its secrets. But Emily wasn't afraid anymore. She had come this far, and there was no turning back. She knew that the house was more than just a building. It was a parasite, a dark force that thrived on fear, grief, and loss. It had been feeding on her family's pain for years, and it had claimed her brother. But Emily wasn't going to let it take her, too. She stepped closer to the furnace, her breath coming faster as the air grew warmer. The room seemed to grow smaller, the shadows stretching toward her as if the house itself was trying to swallow her whole. The whispers grew louder, more insistent, swirling around her like a storm of voices, 1,000 memories calling out for release. They were the voices of her ancestors, of those who had lived and died in this house, of the ones who had been consumed by it. Emily closed her eyes for a moment, blocking out the noise. She had to focus. She had to understand what had happened to Jacob, what had happened to her family, and how to stop it. The letter, the map, the journal, everything had pointed to the furnace. It was the heart of the house, the source of its power. But now, Emily understood that the furnace wasn't just a part of the house. It was the house. It was the vessel that had been feeding on her family's memories for years. And it was time to take control. She took a deep breath and reached out, her hand trembling as it hovered over the furnace. The heat radiated from it, almost unbearable, but Emily pushed forward. The whispers were deafening now, screaming at her to stop, to leave the house before it consumed her. But she couldn't stop. She wouldn't let the house win. Her hand made contact with the cold metal, and instantly, the furnace seemed to react. The room shuddered, the walls groaning under the pressure. The heat intensified, and for a moment, Emily felt like she was suffocating, like the furnace was trying to pull her in, to consume her the way it had consumed Jacob. But Emily wasn't going to let it. She fought against the force, her mind clear, her determination unshakable. With a sharp, forceful movement, Emily yanked open the furnace's door. The sound of metal scraping against metal echoed in the room, and the furnace's breathing became louder, faster, as if it were preparing to devour her whole. But Emily didn't flinch. She stepped forward, her heart pounding in her chest. The furnace's interior was black, deeper than she had ever imagined, a void that seemed to stretch out into infinity. And then, as if by some unspoken command, the room went silent. The furnace stopped breathing. The whispers ceased. The house, for the first time in decades, fell completely still. Emily stepped forward, her eyes scanning the shadows within the furnace, and for a moment she thought she saw something, a shape, a figure, just beyond the door. The shape moved, slowly at first, then faster, until it was standing before her, just inside the furnace, its features obscured by the shadows. Emily's breath caught in her throat, and she instinctively stepped back. But the figure didn't move closer. It simply stood there, waiting, and then, with a sudden jolt, the figure stepped into the light. It was Jacob, but not the Jacob she remembered. He was different. His skin was pale, his eyes wide and unblinking, staring at her with an intensity that sent a shiver down her spine. His clothes were torn, his hair matted and wild. But it was him, her brother, the boy she had loved, the boy who had disappeared so many years ago. "Jacob," she whispered, her voice barely audible over the pounding of her heart. He didn't answer. He just stared at her, his face devoid of expression, his eyes hollow and empty. Emily took a step forward, her hand reaching out, but as soon as her fingers brushed his, a wave of coldness washed over her. It was as if Jacob was no longer a part of the world he had once inhabited. He was something else now, something trapped between the living and the dead. "The house." Jacob's voice was barely a whisper, but it sent a cold shiver through Emily's entire body. "It takes. It remembers. It never forgets." She recoiled, her breath catching in her throat. "What are you talking about? You're not him. You can't be." But Jacob's gaze didn't waver. "I was taken, Emily. Just like it takes everyone. It never lets go." Tears welled in Emily's eyes, and she took another step back. "I'm sorry, Jacob. I'm so sorry." Her voice cracked, the weight of the years crashing down on her. And then, in a flash, the room seemed to grow darker, the furnace glowing with an unnatural light. Emily could feel the house shifting, the air growing thick and oppressive. Jacob's figure began to flicker, his outline becoming less defined, more transparent, as if he were being pulled back into the furnace. "It feeds on memories," he said, his voice distant, fading. "You can't stop it." Emily's hands clenched into fists as she fought back tears. She wouldn't let the house take him again. She couldn't. She reached out, her hand grabbing the edge of the furnace door. The temperature inside the furnace was unbearable now, the heat almost scorching, but she refused to let go. "Jacob!" she screamed, her voice breaking. "I won't let you go again." With a final, desperate cry, Emily slammed the furnace door shut. For a moment, everything was silent. Then slowly, the house seemed to settle. The heat faded, the breathing stopped. The whispers, the pressure, everything that had haunted Emily for so long. It all vanished in that moment. And just like that, the house was still. But Emily knew that she had done something important. She had broken the cycle. She had freed her brother, even if only in spirit. And in doing so, she had freed herself from the house's grip. The price had been steep, but the house would never claim her, or anyone else again. Emily stood in the silent basement, her chest heavy with emotion. The house, once oppressive and alive with whispers, had finally quieted. The furnace no longer hummed with that strange, rhythmic breathing that had haunted her family for decades. For the first time in years, the house felt still, peaceful almost. But that peace came at a cost, a cost that Emily wasn't sure she was ready to bear. She had done it. She had confronted the house. She had faced the memories, the fear, the ghosts of the past. And in doing so, she had freed Jacob. Not in the way she had hoped, not with a reunion, but with an understanding, with closure. The furnace had been the heart of the house's power, feeding off the pain and grief that had taken root there. And when she shut that door, when she finally ended the cycle, she had taken away its strength. But the weight of the journey wasn't over yet. Emily felt the sorrow and the loss pressing in on her, a suffocating weight that refused to let go. Jacob had been her brother, her protector, the one she had laughed with and played with. But he was gone, and while she had freed him from the house's grip, she could never bring him back. She couldn't undo the past. Her hands still rested on the cold metal of the furnace door, as though it were holding on to something that no longer existed. She had freed herself, freed her family, but she still felt empty. She had to let go. She had to accept that Jacob was gone and that the house, for all its power, could not bring him back. Slowly, she turned away from the furnace and stepped toward the stairs. The house felt different now, quieter, but in a way that made her feel lighter. As she climbed the stairs, she couldn't help but notice how the house seemed to breathe differently. More like a home now, not a prison. The weight that had pressed down on her for so many years had lifted, leaving only the memories. The good ones, the happy ones. Emily found herself standing in the hallway, looking at the same photo of Jacob that had hung on the wall for years. His smile was frozen in time, that boyish grin that had always made her feel safe. She had spent so much time in this house, so many moments with him, moments that had been stolen by fear, by the house's darkness. But now, those moments were hers to keep, no longer tainted by the house, no longer haunted by the whispers. Her fingers brushed against the frame of the photograph as she whispered, "Goodbye, Jacob. I love you." For a moment, it felt as though the house itself had paused, as if it were giving her the time she needed to let go. And Emily, in that moment, finally felt peace. She had carried the grief of her brother's disappearance for so long, had let it consume her, had let it define her. But it was time to let that grief go. It was time to move forward, to let the house rest, to let Jacob rest. As Emily turned to leave, she heard the soft creak of the front door. It was open now, inviting her into the world outside, into a life that she hadn't lived in so long. She stepped outside, the crisp air filling her lungs, and she felt a weight lift from her chest. The house, though still standing, was no longer a part of her. It was no longer her burden. She walked away from it, toward the open road. She wasn't running anymore. She wasn't afraid anymore. She had faced the past, faced the house, and in doing so, had found her way back to herself. It was time to begin again. The house stood in the distance, its silhouette framed by the setting sun. The once intimidating structure now seemed small, distant, almost like a memory itself. Emily couldn't help but glance back at it one last time. She had come here seeking answers, seeking closure. And she had found it, though not in the way she had expected. The house, with all its mysteries and secrets, had been the keeper of her family's pain. But now, as she looked at it, she realized that the house wasn't the enemy. It had been a mirror, reflecting the grief, the fear, and the memories of those who had lived within its walls. It had consumed her family, one by one, feeding off their emotions, their pain. But now, it was empty, no longer a prison, no longer a place of torment. The house would stand there for years to come, but it would never hold the same power over her again. As Emily walked away, the weight of the past seemed to lift from her shoulders. She felt lighter, freer, as though the house's grip on her had finally been broken. There was no more whispering, no more haunting. The memories that had once held her captive were hers to keep, not the house's. She took a deep breath, the cool air filling her lungs. She didn't know what the future held, but for the first time in years, she felt like she had a chance to move forward, to live, to remember without the shadow of fear looming over her. The road ahead seemed open, endless, full of possibility. Emily couldn't undo the past, couldn't bring Jacob back, but she could honor his memory. She could live for both of them now. As the sun dipped below the horizon, Emily took one last look at the farmhouse, its outline now fading into the twilight. The house would always be a part of her story, but it no longer defined her. She had found her peace, her freedom, and she was ready to move on.